So now we shall go to fiction. Fiction has several types under it. The first type of non-fiction is short story. A short story is a story in just a few pages. A short story can be a story that comes on a page to 10 to 15, 20 pages. It's a story which is short, usually not more than 3,000 words. But there is no limit, as there is no specific regulation as to the number of words that you must write about for your story to fall under a short story. And an example of a short story is The Thin Around Your Neck, written by Chimamanda Adichie. The Thin Around Your Neck. It is a book that she published which has a number of short stories in it. A number of short stories. She gathered all of the short stories that she has told, that she has written about in her life, and published them under a title called this. So, you may have written a story as well about just anything. It may be real or imagined. As long as that story is not big enough to be called a book, as long as that story is not big enough for you to publish in hard copies, in book format, that falls under short story. There are lots of short stories. I mean, if you go online, you'll see a short story written by Bob Eckert, this your teacher here, titled Panty is Worse Than Hell. Panty is Worse Than Hell. It is a story less than 3,000 words. If you want to get the title down, Panty is Worse Than Hell by Bob Eckert. There are many short stories online as well. You can get many of them and read. One thing about short stories is that you can be done with them in a day, in a few minutes, or even a few hours. Short stories are not so long that you need so many days to read. Now let's move to the second one, which is novella. What is novella? I'll tell you one thing. Novella refers to a story which is bigger than or longer than a short story, but not as big as a novel. It is in between. It is bigger than a short story, but a lot smaller than a novel. It can be a story of about 50 pages. I mean, there are small books that you get all around, whose plots are not usually complicated. Those stories can be told in 50 pages or thereabouts. But when you get stories that are a lot bigger, you can't call them novella. I mean, the difference between novella and novel is LA. But there's a lot to that LA. Are you following me? It is like saying a man and a boy, or a woman and a girl. So you can say novel is either a man or a woman, and novella is either a boy or a girl. Still very small. Now let's go on. What is a novel? A novel is a long story published in hard copies in book format. Long. There is no limit to how long a novel can be. So a novel can be 100 pages, it can be 200 pages, it can be 1,000 pages, it can be 2,000 pages. There are novels as big as 2,000 pages. So a novel can be an end. Okay, of course every story has an end. A story which doesn't have an end is an incomplete story. So a novel can seem endless to the person who doesn't have sufficient energy to read for long. So novels are quite long. The plots are quite complicated, written in very interesting manner such that you won't know until you've got to the end. So many people tend to believe that reading novels can be more interesting than watching movies. I mean, you may not have realized if you've never read a novel. So I advise you today to get a novel and read. Where novels are different from movies is that Novels don't ignore anything in the environment. A novel writes a story about somebody, and while the novel describes the character, it also describes the environment. It describes the aura. It describes the air. It paints everything so lucidly and so picturesquely, such that in your mind you are seeing the images. So novels give you pictures in your head through written words. But take one thing, they are always long, the pages are always long, and that's why they are novels. Now, we go to the next, which is fable. Fable, you must have heard this, fable. Some people say this from the root word fabulous, fabulous, which perhaps refers to a story being extreme, or being absurd, or being false, whatever it is. A fable is an imaginary story. I mean, it is a story written by somebody which may not have happened before. Usually having animals as characters. Animals. You may have watched, you might have watched the story, Stories in Tales by Moonlight, where you perhaps sat under the moon and a father figure told you a story about monkeys and tortoises and donkeys and goats and dogs, and all of them talk. When you read a story about, when you read a story where animals talk, just know that you're reading a fabulous story. Because in real life, animals are not meant to talk. So when in your story, animals speak, then that story is a fable. But usually one thing about fables is that they tend to have hidden meanings, or they tend to preach a certain message. A fable may have at the back of it to advocate a certain message by probably teaching that it is good to be honest, it is good to be truthful. There's a hidden theme behind stories that are called fable. Yeah? There's always a hidden theme. Not hidden necessarily, a theme in fables such that you read and you learn. Now we shall look at the fifth type of fictional writing, which is allegory. Allegory has a lot of similarities with fable. There's a lot of similarities between allegory and fable. The difference is that fable basically must be charactered, must have as its primary characters animals posing as human beings to tell stories. But in the case of allegory, you may have animals or human beings or things being used in that story to communicate deeper meanings to reality. It means that characters in allegory are placed such that the acting in that kind of story relates to a certain event in real time. You get? For example, the story by George Well, Animal Farm. In Animal Farm, the story is such that it has similar resemblance to a particular occurrence in real life. I shall simplify this. The story in Animal Farm, just as it was said, or rather it is said in that book, it has happened before in time, in Russia. So the writer merely used animal to tell a story that has happened before. So when a writer tells a story in a book that bears similarity to one which has happened before, or which is happening in real society, then you know allegory is at play. Because there are lessons to learn, and as well, there's a connection with reality. So allegory is a real story which is told, but using fictional characters. Now let's move on. The next is romance. Romance. When you hear romance, what comes to mind is, okay, a love story. I mean, a story that involves a man and a woman. But no, your mind is wrong. Romance here does not refer to the typical love story between a man and a woman as it is in society. No, romance refers to a story which is out of this world. A story which seems unrealistic because characters in that story are doing things that human beings normally should not be able to do. When you have a story where a certain character in that story has such powers as no mortal should have, like if you perhaps, I don't want to make reference to Superman, Chongo and the rest of them, but just know one thing in your head. The Palm Wine Drinkard by, I think it's Tutuola. If you read your literature book well, you'll see that the Palm Wine Drinkard. It is such that the characters were so extraordinary. The story is just so out of this world. It seems too unique and beautiful, and characters performed roles that were so amazing. So a story that has such height is what we refer to as romance. And then next is parable under fiction. A parable is a story which is not true, but one which teaches moral lessons. Like if you look at your Bible, for those of you who are Christians, you'll have seen the story of the prodigal son. The story of the prodigal son in the Bible is a story which was not real. It never happened. There was no character, there was no time in history where a certain prodigal son did what that prodigal son did and someone had to tell it. No. It's imagined. And the reason was because a lesson needed to be taught. And so that story was imagined and presented so that people could learn from it. And also, there's a story of the Good Samaritan in the Bible. It is also not real. It never happened. But that parable is told in the Bible such that, or rather, so that people who read about the story of the Good Samaritan will learn from it and become good. So, a parable is a very, very short story in perhaps a few lines that communicates deep lessons to the people who hear, because then they learn. The next, which is the H, I think it's the eighth type of non-fiction, is faction. Faction. For faction, you have fact and fiction. Fact and fiction. So creatively, it is called faction. So when you have a fictional story which is based on facts, for example, you have a science fiction. A science fiction. You know, some science fiction stories. These stories never happened, but somebody who is perhaps a scientist and knows how to tell stories uses scientific facts to tell imaginary stories. Such kind of cooking, such kind of build-up, such kind of story put together is what we refer to as faction. Fact plus fiction. Now let's move on. The next we shall look at is Bildungsroman. Bildungsroman. It has a unique name, yes, but it's a very simple type of fictional story. It is a fictional story where the main character, you may say the protagonist is the main character. Such main character develops. Such main character is viewed in different stages of growth. Such main character is seen from childhood to teenagehood to adulthood to perhaps old age. So a story where the protagonist the main character is portrayed from childhood, and then such a character develops in different stages. It's called Bildungsroman. And if you think back, even in movies, you see some movies where the actor, the protagonist of course, is shown from a very tender age, and then you fall in love with that character from that tender age, and you still love the character when the character is grown, blossomed, and then ages. So a character that grows like that, a book that has such a character that grows in such a manner, is called Bildungsroman. I hope you understand. Now we move to the next, which is historical novel. A historical novel is a novel about a true event, but which uses fictional characters, which uses characters other than the real people in the real event. Meaning, let's say there's a story about the Nigerian Biafran War, in which the characters included Ojukwu Odumegwu, Yakubu Gowon, Olusegun Obasanjo, Kaduna Nzeogu. These names are real names, or they were real people in that real event of the Nigerian Biafran War. So let's say I want to write a novel about the Nigerian Biafran War that had all of these characters. I may then choose to say, oh, I don't want to use the name Ojukwu or Obasanjo or, Yakubu Gowon in my story. I want the story to have different names for the real characters. And then I refer to Ojukwu as Ujubu, and I refer to Yakubu Gowon as Abubakar Tahir. Yeah? So, it is a real story I'm telling quite alright in my novel. A real event, a historical event, but I'm using fake names for the characters which were in the original historical event. Such a story is called a historical novel because it tells history but with different identities for the real characters. Now let's move on. The Gothic novel. A Gothic novel is a scary novel. A novel that writes about scary characters and scary situations that make you afraid. A good way to describe a Gothic novel is a horror film. A horror film, a horror film that you watch and then you become scared. In some cases, you're clutching your pillows, you're holding your mom or dad or friend or whoever is close to you. And then afterwards, you're afraid to walk in the dark. So, a Gothic novel is such a novel that instills such degree of fear in you. It is written in a manner as to instill fear. Gory situations, scary situations are painted and made to look even scarier, such that when you read this novel, it sends cold down your bones. And lastly, we shall look at meta fiction. We shall look at this when we come back shortly. Yes, welcome back. Metafiction is a novel that is about novel writing. You get? It is a fiction that is about the creation of fiction. Meaning, when you have a novel, every novel has a theme. Some novels are about crime. Some novels are about hope. Some novels are about kindness, love, name it. But when the theme of your novel is about novel writing. You know, there are some stories about stories. There are some stories about story making or storytelling. So in this case, the center focus of the novel is about how to write a novel. It's about novel. Like, you may have a novel where the major character is struggling to publish his or her novel. He or she has written a book that he or she wants to publish, and then goes around looking for publishers and all of the intrigues that he or she sees in the course of looking for publishers, you know. And you know, there'll be intrigues, there'll be high points, low points, you know, and all of that. Such a story is called metafiction, because it's a fiction about fiction. It's a novel about novel. That is as simple as it is. So when you read a book and you see that in the course of the book it is dominated by somebody trying to publish a novel, in the course of that the steps and procedures of writing novels and publishing and all of these are included or embodied in that piece of work, then you should realize that what you're reading is classified as metafiction.